traveling a lot.
Yeah. We are live. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm Dr. Josiah Marineau with Executive Director Josh Keats. I'll refer to him as Josh. He works with the Kentucky Homeland Security Institute. We're having a conversation today about how 9/11 changed U.S. policy, both domestic and international. Director Keats will discuss the domestic changes in the United States regarding security as a result of 9/11, touch a bit on some of his personal experiences. He has a fascinating biography. I'll touch on some of the foreign affairs aspect of 9/11, touch on that, followed by a Q&A for the last half of the broadcast tonight. Thank you all for joining us. We had to kind of put this broadcast together on sort of short notice, but we'd really love to appreciate the work of the production team in helping to make this event a possibility. And thank you, Director Keats, for your flexibility joining with us online.
My pleasure. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite. So as requested, the first part of my discussion will be about how I wound up as the Executive Director for the Kentucky Office of Homeland Security, how 9/11 shaped my career. On 9/11, as most people of my age range, I know exactly where I was, what I was doing, and every part of that day and many days thereafter I can recall in detail. I was a firefighter EMT working part-time and going to UK full-time. And I remember catching the news as I was leaving my apartment to go to class, and I had a broken leg from falling through a floor, fighting a fire earlier that summer. And I remember being on crutches and had been so for several weeks. And I decided that day that I was going to cut off my cast and rejoin, life and get into the fight however I could. So from there, I finished my degree in emergency medicine from Eastern Kentucky University, and I decided that I wanted to be useful to the world in every way that I could: police, fire, EMS, and then I wanted to pursue diplomacy and the Foreign Service as a special agent with the U.S. State Department. So in doing that, I got to see the world, but I also got to benefit, unfortunately, from 9/11 in the State Department and security organizations and law enforcement organizations federally plussed up their numbers massively post 9/11. Organizations like the Federal Air Marshals were really very small organizations pre 9/11. And post 9/11, you see that organizations like the Federal Air Marshals, airport security screening processes, et cetera, have become just massive organizations staffed by thousands of people. So in the State Department, I got to see firsthand what the war in Iraq especially looked like. I lived there off and on at various posts, including the embassy in Baghdad, a post outside of the Green Zone in Baghdad near the international airport, and then also in southern Iraq in Basra. So from there, I got to see what 9/11's effects specifically on the war on terror were firsthand. So that's sort of my biography in a nutshell. What has changed? So, being an individual who's newly in the age range of the 40-year-olds, I can remember vividly what pre-9/11 looked like. I can remember what air travel was prior to 9/11, and quite frankly, I miss that quite a bit. I would say that most people in the college audience probably have only known what the war on terror, only know that war on terror has existed their entire life, and may not have firsthand knowledge of what pre-9/11 really was. So what has changed? So the granular things of our daily lives, such as going to the airport and being screened thoroughly prior to airline travel, that was much different pre-9/11. Also experiencing a global war on terror. The only thing that, my age range would be able to liken it to is the war on drugs. And so, there was, my generation grew up with the war on drugs, and now we have a whole other generation that's grown up with just war on terror. What else has changed? So we've like I've mentioned, we've plussed up a lot of our law enforcement, diplomatic, foreign service mechanisms. Pre 9/11, a lot of our embassies in high threat areas would have been closed. Now we have embassies that exist in places that are not friendly. In fact, they are almost not permissive to operate, but we are still there trying to bring America into those places and act as good diplomats for the United States. So there's just a number of other mechanisms that have changed as far as our intelligence gathering and how we fuse together information from really what pre 9/11 were desperate agencies that clung to sort of their own little fiefdoms of information. And so, for example, the FBI, the CIA, State Department, and other intelligence agencies, all in hindsight, had a piece of the 9/11 puzzle in analyzing and putting together all of the pieces of the puzzle post 9/11 and the investigations that went on and how this could have happened. The government realized that they needed to put together these fiefdoms for a collective intelligence product. And so that is the genesis of fusion centers across the United States and our territories. And that is one of the offices that is within the greater Kentucky Office of Homeland Security, is the Kentucky Intelligence Fusion Center, which my office oversees. So also, having been a federal agent and relied on fusion centers to provide me rapid in the field information, those services didn't exist prior to 9/11. So in most federal agents go out into areas, especially with the State Department, go out into areas that can be rural, quite far away from your home office. So you're out of radio contact and potentially even cell phone contact with your nearest backup. So it was critical that I could rely on a fusion center to not only provide me quick information into not only criminal databases, but Secret Service databases, criminal databases, commercial information, and then one-stop shop. And so the fusion of intelligence has really come a long way since 9/11. And that will sort of lead me back into the other Josiah on this on this presentation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm sure our audience will follow up with a lot of questions based on what you just shared. Yeah, so that's, I think, a great take. I appreciate your personal account. Before I kind of dive into my thing, my students today, I made that same point. Like 9/11, for those of us that were, alive and, of a sufficient age, will always remember where we were that day. And on my story was, I was a freshman in college in my second or third week of the semester, and this was in Alaska, so 4 hours time difference. And I remember I was kind of, excited to go to class, bounding down the stairs, and the TV was on, and the Twin Towers were smoking. They'd not fallen by that point. And then, it was shocking. And then the days afterwards as well, just this uncertainty and the sense of what are we going to do about this was certainly very, very prominent. So Director Keats touched on some of the domestic changes responding to the 9/11 attacks. I wanted to touch briefly on some of the foreign affairs. I'll try to keep my comments to less than 10 minutes, but I'm going to share my screen with the audience. So the question I'm answering is how the attack on the Twin Towers changed our foreign policy. The Basic answer is the attack led the United States to engage in what Director Keats has been describing as the global war on terror, this international effort to prevent another similar attack from happening within the US. I think on most measures, you can say that the war on terror was successful in preventing another domestic terror attack, but it also has come with significant costs in achieving that kind of goal. Just to kind of do my professor thing, defining some key terms. Well, what do we mean by foreign policy? If it's changed, what's foreign policy? Foreign policy is just how one country engages with another. There can be a range of actions countries can take. They can become allies. They can engage in trade. They can compete with one another for territory, for resources, and whatnot. But that's what foreign policy means. Historically, in the US, we've kind of vacillated between two different orientations towards the rest of the world. We have one stance that we can call isolationism, which is saying that the US should focus more on domestic resources, domestic problems, and not really engage in things that are happening across the oceans. The contrary stance, and we've really seen this since World War II, is this idea of internationalism. This idea that the United States has interests that go beyond its borders and therefore should be engaged in helping to solve and direct global interests. US foreign policy has always been a little indecisive about which orientation to take. So if foreign policies changed after 9/11, well, what did it look like before 9/11? Very briefly, you can see two main phases in US foreign policy after the Second World War. The first is the Cold War, lasting from about 1948 to 1991. This is defined by the global struggle against the Soviet Union for allies, largely over what kind of economic system is going to be the dominant mode of organizing an economy. Is it going to be capitalism, communism? The US is successful in this competition after the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union by the early 90s, the US is in this unique situation where it's sort of like a global superpower without any obvious competition. One author, Charles Krautheimer, calls this the unipolar moment, where we have this sort of unrivaled global supremacy. Well, and the question becomes, what do we do with that as a country? What should our foreign policy goals be? And we don't quite come up with the sufficient answer to that question. We try different things in the 90s. We try promoting democracy around the world. We try humanitarian intervention in countries undergoing civil wars and crises. We try to promote globalization, the lowering of trade barriers and barriers to financial flows. Well, it's not quite clear what our organizing strategy is in the 90s, especially compared to the Cold War. Well, that's where 9/11 comes in. 9/11, with the launch of the global war on terrorism, becomes a sort of guiding strategic principle for the US. Very shortly after the Twin Towers fell, the decision was made to go after state sponsors of terrorism. And this becomes the initial way that we prosecute the war on terrorism. We go after countries that are harboring terrorists or countries that we believe have malign interests towards us. The first country we go after is Afghanistan. Afghanistan at the time was led by the Taliban, which was harboring al-Qaeda. We then follow that up with the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Both countries, very different scenarios, but similar patterns are seen in both cases. Initially, both invasions are successful. We chased the Taliban out of Afghanistan within a matter of weeks after special forces arrive. Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq in the 80s and 90s, his regime quickly crumbles when the US invades. So initially, it looks like this is going to be successful. The problem in both countries is that they experience lingering and then growing insurgencies that are very difficult to combat. Counterinsurgency operations are very time intensive, and that's not what we were expecting to do. Compounding this is the failure of both governments to ever really function effectively. The Iraqi military never really functioned well on its own. We've seen recently what's happened with the Afghan military with the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban once again. So the attacking state sponsors of terrorism is a key aspect of the global war on terrorism. There's been also lots of intelligence sharing between the U.S. and its allies, trying to identify and track down potential terrorists and to try to identify and apprehend them. Okay, did this all work? Well, again, it depends what we mean by work. There hasn't been an attack in the U.S. on the scale of 9/11 over the past 20 years. I've read the count that there's been about 107 fatalities relating to religious extremist terrorism. About half of those coming from the attack on the club in Florida. Domestic terrorism, ironically, over the past 20 years has become more of a central issue in terms of where we're seeing most activity. So it's worked in the sense that it's prevented another 9/11, but the cost has been pretty staggering. U.S. actions in the Middle East have contributed to rising resentment towards the United States. That just provides a fertile ground for people who are alienated and looking for a cause to maybe joining a religious group that's going to attack the United States. And we're also seeing the rise of religious extremist groups such as ISIS, who are willing to carry out attacks, especially in the Middle East, but also in places like Europe. So the cost of the global war on terrorism has also been pretty substantial. Should it continue? Well, the world has changed a lot in the past 20 years. Terrorism is not going to go away as a problem, clearly. But we also have challenges that are probably a bit more pressing on U.S. concerns. Issues like the rise of China as a global competitor to the U.S., North Korea and its nuclear ambitions. The rise of cybercrime has caused significant challenges for businesses, companies, and infrastructure. So the war on terrorism provided a solution to the problem of the 90s, this issue of what our foreign policy is going to be. It's not clear that it can provide that same strategic orientation in the world today. But I have to conclude on this point because I put together this presentation and then the world happened. With the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban in the past few weeks, it suggests that religious extremism is not going to cease having an influence in the region and probably the broader world. So that's at least my brief take on this question. So let's open it up to the audience. I had a few questions for you, Director Keats. Anything you want to respond to?
One of the points that we should also make in regard to the effect on our foreign policy is that in taking out some of these international leaders, or even just regional leaders, like Saddam Hussein, has allowed for the proliferation of terrorism in an unexpected way. So in the region, after we invaded Iraq, Iraq, I guess fortunately, unfortunately, kept Iran at bay for us.
Right.
And kept Iran and Iraq engaged in something so that Iran wouldn't have us to focus on. Well, now with Saddam Hussein out of the way, we were in their way to gain control over the rest of Iraq and oil territory. And this opened up a really complicated set of issues in how do we deal with, the allies of these other countries that we're now directly or indirectly engaged with. So, sort of brought into the fight was Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Turkey. That exposes NATO to a great amount of risk with, their eons of misgivings with the Kurdish region, who was very friendly to us in our entire time in Iraq. So those foreign policy issues became a lot more complicated after we removed Saddam Hussein from power.
Yeah, if you ask, has any country benefited from the U.S. invasion of Iraq? And Iran is often pointed to. If anyone's benefited, Iran, because their influence is just, as you said, really extended into to Iraq.
And personally, as a Foreign Service Special Agent for the State Department, one of the biggest fights that I got into was to protect the Iranian foreign minister during the UN General Assembly in 2011 in my favorite suit.
So you said it was a fight. So were some people opposed to protecting this individual?
No, so this brings in another strange bedfellow for our foreign counterparts. So when when foreign countries come to the United States for the UN General Assembly, they fall into two protective categories. Generally, the Secret Service gets presidents, and the State Department gets all others. So the foreign minister of Iran was assigned to my detail, and the foreign minister and leadership of Sudan wanted to come and meet with our protectee, but they brought weapons with them, didn't want to drop them, and decided that they wanted to go ahead and have a fight about it. So we gave it to them, and turned them back. And I personally put handcuffs on 3 different people, and we wound up, letting them go and recognizing their diplomatic status, but encouraging them to no longer bring weapons into our secure environment.
Wow, that's great. Was the foreign minister, was this Zavid?
What's that? Shoot. Just 2011. I'm sure we could look it up.
Okay, yeah, I think that was before him. Anyway.
Ahmadinejad was the prime minister, and we were co-located with him for most of it.
Ahmadinejad. Wow, bringing me back. Fascinating. Okay. Let's see. Any questions? So one question that I'd like to hear your thoughts on. Do you think that the 9/11 attacks increased security? Like you mentioned, the airports. Has this changed American culture? Have we become increasingly kind of security conscious?
I think in our daily lives, the answer is both yes and no. I think that there are a lot of people who recognize that, the world is just a dangerous place, and that we have vulnerabilities from both domestic and foreign terrorists. And that, so when we, go to places that are mass gatherings, you have events like Las Vegas, you have events like the Orlando nightclub shooting, mass tragedies that have happened, one because of some foreign sympathies, and one just, we don't really have a reason, a rationale why an individual would go to an elevated position and just start machine gunning down hundreds of civilians. Mm-hmm. So I think that because of those current events, people do have a security mindset. However, from personal experience, in coming back and forth to Louisville from a war zone, I would leave Iraq and transit through Jordan and come back to Louisville. And I remember leaving this the Louisville International Airport through the the arrivals gate, and seeing parked cars down in the pickup area. Well, that's kind of a no-no overseas. You don't really, park your car anywhere, especially in sort of an enclosed environment. And maybe this is just an example of my PTSD or just a security, scar mindset that I have. But while waiting for my ride, I went to the very far end of the airport, away from the parked cars, and positioned myself behind a stone column, a large one, so that I would feel safe. So in some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. We don't live our lives like we're in a high threat environment here in the United States, but we have become accustomed to sort of the deep security screenings that we have to do for some of our normal daily lives, like going into courthouses now and going onto airplanes and other venues, even schools. Not because of foreign influence, but because of, mass school shootings. Even some schools have metal detectors and require clear backpacks, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned earlier about the changes in airport security. Another thing I shared with my students, and the older folks on the call will recognize. You used to be able to walk up to the gate. If you had a relative who was departing, you could go to the gate and wait with them until they left on their flight.
That's
and
right.
That's something you can't do anymore.
No. The movie Love Actually highlights what pre 9/11 flight was like. So if you as you head into the Christmas season, check that out. But there will never be a time where a little boy can run through security at an international airport without causing a major shutdown.
They would take you down. You would not get very far.
You would not get far.
I appreciate the security, changes. I was actually flying now we have to take off our shoes, obviously.
Right.
I was actually flying the day that was put in place, because I think that was in response to an attack in London, the London city bombings. This is 2006, and I remember that morning they were rushing to the gates and putting that on. That's my only one about the security concerns that I find distasteful,
Yeah.
as looking at the shoes. But
Yeah, I see that we've had some questions popped up in the chat box. Are we supposed to address those?
so yeah, go ahead. So here's a question from Mr. Keats. Hearing you discuss some of the protocols that have changed since 9/11, what do you foresee changing today and in the future?
That is a great question. What I foresee is technology playing a major role in expediting security, especially when it comes to personnel screening at major events, travel points of location. But I also see somewhat of a slowdown in, not necessarily in globalism, but as also the pandemic has affected our lives, we will see a slowdown in some international travel and domestic travel as well. You know, a lot of companies that operated on a pretty strict travel face-to-face schedule have found that they can slash those travel funds out of their budgets and can operate from a remote posture and have effective meetings virtually. So, you know, there are a lot of things that are going to go into what affects our security in the future, and some of it might be a little bit of a drop in use. But technology, especially, I foresee being a major part of individual screening, as well as, you know, we're moving into. You probably saw recently in the news that Kentucky is going to have virtual licensing. And as well as other states, you know, moving away at some point in the future from having a physical driver's license and physical ID. So, you know, I think there are some major technological advancements that are going to play a critical role in at least expediting how we deal with security evaluations in our daily lives.
And on that point, as more and more of our life, okay, well, if I could jump in on this point, because it relates to what you were just saying, then we get to this question about privacy. How do cyber crimes and also maybe cyber terrorism, how does that factor into our security concerns as more and more of our life is online?
You know, this is the question of the day, really. So, in cyber crimes really envelop so many facets of our lives. In their economic crimes, there are crimes of human trafficking that are related to cyber, especially when it comes to child sexual exploitation and dark web trading of imagery, and really just awful things that come with the cyber realm. But is there a way that you can put the question back up so that I can make sure I get it all? Sometimes I have a goldfish memory. There we go. How do we balance the need? And having been on both sides of the aisle, just being a private citizen, but also having been a federal agent and getting search warrants and wiretaps on major felons, that ongoing investigations. You know, there is a time and place for the government to sort of peek behind the curtain in allowing a court to make that decision. However, you know, our cell phones follow us everywhere, and there are places and times where even our loved ones can, especially when it comes to sort of cyber stalking, things of that nature, where even our loved ones can violate our privacy. And so those are major concerns, you know, that human trafficking and cyber stalking, as well as what international state actors can do to sort of keep us on our heels. In the news lately, you have seen where a number of ransomware attacks have occurred across the United States, and Kentucky is not immune from these attacks, and they have been occurring, to major healthcare facilities to individual law firms. And there's a ransom tied to it. Generally, these agencies are locked out of their files until they either are able to institute their backups, or they flatly, pay somebody to fix it or engage with the people who are ransoming them. So in a lot of these actors are trained by state agencies. And you mentioned China, but China, Russia, Iran, other of our foreign adversaries do want to keep pressure on our society in any way, shape, and form that they can. And if they can have, a bunch of independent ransomware hackers applying pressure to us in our healthcare systems, at our individual wallets, slowing things down for us, making things more expensive, that's what they're going to do. They're just going to apply pressure all the time to mitigate our decline. And so the best way to combat that is as individuals take it upon ourselves to make sure that we back up the things that we need, to make sure that our online hygiene is impeccable. And if you see something, say something. If somebody is trying to elicit a response from you and that you don't know them, you can disengage from them. But if there's a little more to it, let authorities know. If your identity has been compromised, let the appropriate authorities know.
So I'm seeing questions popping in from the audience. One person is asking about kind of anti-Muslim bias, xenophobia about people from the Middle East. How much is this hate crimes and these kinds of issues are we still seeing towards that population in the U.S.?
One of my favorite quotes of all time is, the key to world peace is world travel. And I think that, one of the unfortunate parts about America is that, we have everything from sea to shining sea here. We offer deserts, mountaintops, oceans, plains. And so most Americans can find all of their travel needs within the confines of our borders. And so a very small percentage of American citizens wind up getting a passport and actually going overseas. And I will tell you that having lived and traveled all over the Middle East, there are some of the finest people that I have ever worked with, that I have encountered in my travels and work. In fact, there were several people that worked with me on high threat details that I wished I could have just put in my pocket and brought home with me. I would have personally adopted them as my adopted brother if I could. There's just a bond, a loyalty, and a trust that comes with working and trusting each other with your lives, and you get to know somebody intimately in that way. And it's unfortunate that there are sort of xenophobic issues within the United States, but I think no more so than there were prior to the war on terror. Especially you can take that. The pandemic has also exposed some of these rifts. Sure. And had it not been for the pandemic, I don't think that you would have necessarily had as many of these social upheaval areas across the United States that we encountered. In Washington State, here in Louisville, Kentucky, it was just the right environment for things that have been brewing to fester and bubble over.
Sure. Yeah. Well, one other question I see kind of on this point: how realistic is a threat of Islamic terrorism today?
So, in my estimation, especially taking into light the recent developments in Afghanistan, we now have a country that is led by the Taliban, that is very friendly with a number of recognized terrorist organizations. And there are a number of things that an organized country can allow those terrorist organizations to achieve and to facilitate that would not have been able to happen had the U.S. or the government that we were supporting in Afghanistan remained in power. And so there are some dangerous things that that, in my assessment, could occur in the future because they now have the catalyst of governmental cover. What does that mean for our domestic security? That remains to be seen, but I can assure you that there are a number of eyes, ears, and minds that are processing intelligence as we speak constantly across the United States and within the Commonwealth to make sure that we intercept any of those plans and thwart them to the very best of our abilities. But also a key partner in this is our civilian population in keeping an eye out for things that are odd, that make the hair on the back of our neck stand up. Seeing somebody in class that, for whatever reason, appears to not fit in a way that makes you feel like you're threatened for your own safety. And letting your teachers know, or letting law enforcement know when you see somebody staking out a critical infrastructure, seeing somebody taking pictures of a bridge that would otherwise have no recognizable purpose. So that is one part of our overall security that's critical, is having, individual citizens let us know when things stand out.
Sure. So related to this, I saw a question pop up. So here in Kentucky, does the Office of Homeland Security, do you focus more on domestic threats, or are you more dealing with international threats?
The Kentucky Office of Homeland Security, I would say, focuses on all sorts of different portfolios. In fact, our analysts are assigned to domestic, international, school safety, critical infrastructure. And so we look at everything all the time to the greatest effect that our bandwidth will allow. So in fact, we actually have several analysts right now that are producing products of a classified nature that are being digested by our federal partners nationally and internationally. But we also do a lot with domestic security in assessing, where the next hot buttons are going to be, evaluating domestic terrorism involvement, and things of that nature.
All right. Fascinating. Let's see. I see another question here about whether the Iraq invasion changed the course in Afghanistan, which is kind of an interesting question. One argument, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, is that the Iraq invasion sort of distracted us from kind of completing the job in Afghanistan. We were only in Afghanistan for a year and a half or so before the Iraq invasion started. And then all the resources that maybe could have gone to that conflict were diverted to Iraq. And then, of course, we know how the story had evolved from there. Do you have a sense about that?
I think that sort of the answer is yes. It definitely did change it because of, I talk about bandwidth. We only have so much military.
Sure.
So when you have two wars in two, very different locations, there is no focus as far as, finishing one task and starting another. And they were also different. They were different wars just because Afghanistan was different than Iraq. Maybe they're similar, but, still different enough that tactics in one location weren't exactly the tactics that could be applied in the other.
Sure.
So, but also, as we mentioned previously, when in my expertise is definitely more Iraq than Afghanistan because that's where I lived. But as we mentioned previously, when Saddam Hussein was removed from power and we removed the army of Iraq, Iran flourished, and that became a much more complicated monster than just dealing with Iraq.
And with Iran kind of benefiting from the chaos in Iraq, has that had a bearing on U.S. security? Of course, maybe in Iraq, but also domestically as well. Has it been a threat on both levels?
Oh, for sure. Especially in Iraq. In fact, most of the attacks that took place against U.S. interests were really the Iranian terror network, or Iranian-backed militias. So that Iran's influence is very deep now into Iraq, where they were at war for a number of years and sworn enemies. So now their influence was largely unchecked while I was there. And how has that affected us domestically? Well, Iran is definitely, in the business of producing, or has been in the business of producing nuclear material. So that is a major concern to us. And they also have robust cyber capabilities, robust ability to fund terror networks across the world. And those are all deeply concerning things that a large amount of time and attention is spent on making sure that they're not going to be encroaching upon our domestic security.
Sure. See, another question has popped up in the channel. Do you feel that the U.S. government, federal, state, local levels, do you feel that they have the tools that they need to address the threats we're facing?
Addressing threats, like anything else, is a pendulum. And, we get really good at it. We get really good at sharing information for a little while. And I think that happened after 9/11, and that, that happened across the U.S. You could see that U.S. citizens were united for a brief amount of time. We were all Americans, and we were not, Cubs fans or, Louisville fans or UK fans. For a brief amount of time, we were U.S. citizens and Americans, and American flags flew on every front lawn across the nation. But in that posture took place in the law enforcement and emergency responder community. Well, now you can also see that some of that's sort of waned, and you can see that in sometimes the sharing of information, and some of those fiefdoms have built back up over time. The way to combat that is through trusted long-term relationships. The federal government moves people around constantly, at least with the State Department, some with the Federal Bureau of Investigations, although they're a little slower to move people than other agencies are. And so sometimes that can be an impediment to building those long-term trusted relationships that are needed to have the free flow of information. And that was really the intended purpose of Congress establishing fusion centers and funding them across the United States, was to have sort of a state repository of criminal and intelligence information, so that we could parse out and put things together, put the puzzle pieces together to identify potential terrorism threats. Could it be better? Absolutely. Could it be much worse? For sure. But I think we have the tools. It's just a matter of making sure that information flows freely between agencies.
Sure. Well, I'm looking at my list of questions, and it looks like we've gone through the questions that have been posed in the channel. So I thank everyone who was able to pop a question to us. Please do so if you have one that you've been dying to ask. But on that point, we can maybe end on a few closing words. Maybe I'll give Director Keats the last word, but I would just like to say, for one, Director Keats, I really appreciate your time and your expertise to meet with myself, with our audience today, and sharing your expertise and sharing your experience. It really has been very delightful getting to hear your stories. I suppose the other thing I would say is that it's like I told students that 9/11, as we said, was a day when everyone's going to remember where they were on that day. And I don't know if we have had a day like that since. And I hope for the sake of our students that that day doesn't come, but in all likelihood, it will. So it's important to use these times like these to mark what has happened and to reflect on how it has changed us both individually and personally, as Director Keats was sharing, and also as a country. So I think these are opportunities to really reflect and see how things have gone, to give us a sense of where we're going. And Director Keats, love to hear your last comments.
I have a couple. One is that, I oftentimes think of let me see if I can move the sun out of the way here. None of that's going to work. So one of the things that I think of many times in my career is the falling man coming out of the 9/11 structure. And that motivates me to make sure that I pay attention to everything that comes across my desk and to make sure that I don't miss anything, and to make sure that I do my best to be a diplomat for the United States and to give our best face and our best representation to our foreign partners and make sure that we're collaborating effectively. But it also reminds me that, not every day is promised, and to live life to the fullest, and especially to our students out there that are listening, this is your time to learn and to ingest as much information as possible. You don't get these opportunities to just dedicate yourself to full-time studies, and this is the time to do it so that you can be, a successful part of not only our society, but if you choose to go into something of intelligence nature, you will have already a good background. And then I'll leave you with this, that, part of the Kentucky Intelligence Fusion Center and the Kentucky Office of Homeland Security is that we have the Intelligence Liaison Officer program. I mentioned this several times during our talk, that a critical piece of domestic security is the intelligence that we get from tips from our citizens across the Commonwealth. We offer a training program that it's called Intelligence Liaison Officer, and you can come in and we vet your background and provide you with a very solid, robust day-long course that basically makes you part of our trusted intelligence network. And so for anybody out there that is interested in receiving more information, please hop on our website at the Kentucky Office of Homeland Security and ping us for more information. We'd be happy to engage in those discussions with you.
It's a great opportunity. Thank you for sharing that. Once again, I'd like to thank our production team for putting this broadcast together on short notice. Director Keats, it's been a pleasure. And thank you to the audience once again for joining us for this conversation. Have a good night, everybody.